To talk about muscle contraction, we've got to talk about what's happening at the neuromuscular junction. So we know that a muscle cell, each muscle cell has a connection to the central nervous system through a neuron. So if we have our brain here, so if this is the brain and spinal cord, all right, so brain, spinal cord, the neuron originates in the central nervous system, so in the spinal cord. So the neuron will originate here, so its cell body will be here in the spinal cord. It will come out and it will then go to a muscle and its terminals, so there's usually more than one terminal coming out of a neuron, and each one of those terminals will get to a muscle fiber. Okay. So if we go down here and make just one big one, here's my, make that better. All right, so here's my one terminal, and it's going down to innervate. So here's its little axon terminal. And it will innervate its muscle cell. So here's the muscle cell. Going across there. So when we look at the neuromuscular junction, this is the neuron, this is the axon terminal. It's not actually touching the muscle cell. All right? There is a gap between here. So a gap that we call the cleft. So since the neuron doesn't actually touch the muscle cell, we're getting the stimulus for the muscle to contract from the neuron, so we have to somehow get that impulse, that stimulus from neuron over to the muscle cell, the sarcolemma of the muscle cell. So this right here is the sarcolemma. Okay. And remember, and I'm going to kind of put this in here just so that you can remember that this is here. Remember that in the sarcolemma, there are invaginations of the sarcolemma that go down into the muscle cell and wrap around T-tubules. Okay, so these are going to become T-tubules here. All right, so just want to remember that anatomy there. So the action potential or the stimulus is going to originate in the spinal cord, okay, at the cell body of the neuron. So that is here. Okay, that action potential is going to go down the neuron and be propagated down the entire axon of the neuron. So action potential. So it is going to follow down all the way down to the end of its, the end of the axon. And of course, it's going to go through to all of its terminals. So it's going to go to this one. Okay. Inside of the axon terminal, we're going to see vesicles. And inside those vesicles are chemicals. And these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit neurological messages. That's what they're there for. In this case, at the neuromuscular junction, this particular neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. Or ACH. So these vesicles that are full of acetylcholine, we're basically going to use that chemical and get it across the cleft, and it's going to do something to this area of the muscle cell. Now the muscle cell, this part of the muscle cell is called the motor end plate. And the motor end plate is the area that is adjacent to the axon terminal. The axon terminal of the neuron. So you can see the rest of the muscle cell's not in contact with that. It's not touching it anyway, even at the motor end plate, but this is where that cleft is, and where the axon terminal is coming close to the muscle cell. So when the action potential comes down the neuron and it goes to the motor end plate, there are channels that are on the end plate, and I'm going to put them here. And these channels are what we call voltage-gated channels. And that means that these channels are not always open. They're usually closed. They have gates on them. And only a certain type of stimulus will open them. And in this case, it is a change in potential. So a change in voltage, which is happening through the action potential coming down the axon, is going to change the potential at the neurolemma, or the plasma membrane of the axon, and it's going to open these gates. These particular voltage-gated channels, these channels, are specific for calcium ions. And there's more calcium on the outside here than on the inside. So as soon as that action potential comes down and the gate opens, calcium is going to flow in. And when calcium comes in, calcium is needed to stimulate exocytosis. And that's what it does to these vesicles. So the calcium comes in, and the vesicles then come down and go through exocytosis on the membrane of the axon terminal here. And when they do that, the acetylcholine diffuses out into the cleft. So now we have acetylcholine there. The acetylcholine will come across the cleft to the motor end plate. And at the motor end plate, there are other channels that are also gated. They're not always open, but these channels are called chemically gated channels. And they have receptors on them that receive some kind of chemical, and when it binds, it will open them. So these particular chemically gated channels look for acetylcholine. So acetylcholine will come down and bind to these channels. So acetylcholine diffuses across the cleft and binds to the gates. And when they do that, those gates open. As soon as those gates open, then when the gates open, sodium and potassium move in and out of the cell. All right, so that's the first part of this stimulus here. Now I've shown you at this point that it's occurring in the central nervous system at the spinal cord. It's coming down that neuron, the neuron axon. It's going to the axon terminal, and then we're getting neurotransmitter called acetylcholine into the cleft due to the calcium from these voltage-gated channels. And that acetylcholine is coming across and binding here onto the chemical gates. These chemical gates are open, sodium and potassium are moving. So on the next video, I'm going to continue this and show exactly what happens at the motor end plate from this happening.